Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Understanding AT Processes in the Illinois Assistive Technology Guidance Manual, presented by Gail Bowser and hosted by Infinitec. This is Samantha Conklin, and I'm an Assistive Technology Facilitator for Infinitec, and I will be moderating the webinar this afternoon.
Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome back to the second of 4 webinars regarding the new Illinois Assistive Technology Guidance Manual. I'm Gail Bowser. I am the author for the current version of the manual and editor for the work that was done in version 1 of this guide, which was completed in 2012 by Brian Wojcik and Karen Douglas at the Seed Center. We're happy to have you join us today. We're looking forward to a very active conversation. We had quite a lot of conversation in our first session, and I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions again today. I wanted you to know that I am an independent consultant. I did provide consultation and was the primary editor for the second edition of the Illinois AT Guidance Manual, this edition that we're talking about today. And if you have specific questions or things you want to ask me about after the webinar today, you can reach me at gailbowser@gmail.com. You'll see it there on the screen. We wanted you to know and emphasize that the information in the second edition of the Illinois AT Guidance Manual is provided as a support to districts in order to clarify procedural questions and describe effective AT practices. If you've looked at the guide in the last week, when we released it last week, you will have noticed that there are really 2 aspects to the guide. The first part of the guide, the first 3 chapters, are really about compliance and what different laws apply to the topic of assistive technology. And then the remaining chapters in the guide are really about process and making sure that students get effective, equitable, and ethical assistive technology services. So one of the things that came up as a question last week was somebody said, we don't do it exactly the way it's discussed in the guide. We don't do assessment exactly the way it is discussed in the guide. So do we have to change what we're doing? And the Illinois State Board of Education asked me to make sure that you know that if your current district practices are established and working, no part of this guidance should be interpreted as a need to change them unless the AT practices and procedures do not provide the child with faith in the least restrictive environment. So if you encounter questions regarding what you're doing or the compliance with IDEA or other national and state statutes, we really recommend that you contact your district attorney if you have serious concerns about what you're doing in your district. We believe that the guide itself has clarified a lot of things and also suggested some new strategies for providing effective assistive technology services. But it's always good to check if you're not sure. Today's topic is an overview of AT processes. Last time we talked about what was new in the guide, specific things that we felt would really be of interest to the field as a whole, and also we just discussed all the different chapters that have been changed. So we gave you an overview. This week we're going to talk about AT processes. But we also want you to know that there are 2 other webinars in this series, and we'll have more time to talk in depth and address more detailed questions. What we discovered last time was that we could not get to every question that was typed into the question box. And so we reviewed the text from the question box during the past week, and we believe that we've addressed many of the questions that you provided to us in today's presentation. But we're hoping that you'll have more questions and more ways that you can help us to clarify the content in this guide. We're also hoping to develop a frequently asked questions document that accompanies the new guide so that we can be a little bit more specific and get some good guidance from ISBE as we do that. So if you have questions today, please type them into the question box. And if we can't address them today, we will either address them in a future webinar or in the frequently asked questions document that we're beginning to prepare. Here's an example of some of the questions that we got from last week's webinar. One person asked, can you give a general definition of assistive technology? And then that person said, as an SLP, I have a specific idea in mind when I think about AT or AAC. And then this person wanted to know, does AT also include computer screen enlargement for visually impaired students, etc.? So the best way I know to answer that question is to give you the IDEA legal definition of assistive technology. And I have to say that one of the unique things about assistive technology is that in every federal law I'm aware of, the definition of assistive technology is almost identical. So assistive technology under federal guidance and federal definitions means any item, piece of equipment, or product system, whether acquired commercially off the shelf, modified, or customized, that's used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of a child with a disability. Now, in some of the other federal laws that use this definition, you will find that it's increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of a person with a disability or an individual with a disability. But the primary focus of this definition is increase, improve, or maintain capabilities of a person with a disability. And the other main feature in this definition is that it is any item, piece of equipment, or product system. So anything you can touch and see or at least watch operate could qualify as assistive technology. We tend to know a lot about the assistive technology that the students we work with might be using, but maybe not so much about some of the technology that other students with different kinds of disabilities might also benefit from. So we wanted to make sure that you had the general definition, and then you can apply it to your own situation and your own students. The next question that we got that I wanted to address up front today is this one. A student with a learning disability is in the 6th grade and struggles with reading comprehension. He's currently working on no-tech reading strategies, so he's learning new reading skills, phonemic awareness, and things like that. But a teacher would like to try a read-aloud computer with him to see if it increases his comprehension of text. The teacher has knowledge pertaining to AT. So that's the question that we got. And the end result of that question was, how would this be seen in the context of assessment, consideration, and evaluation? So the response that we got, and we did check with ISBE about this one, is that this would be a classroom assessment. So you have a student who is identified as having difficulty with reading. He has IEP goals in the area of reading, so that domain has been opened and evaluation has been done. But this particular classroom assessment, where they try some things before the IEP meeting, could be considered assessment, and the information from that assessment could be brought to the IEP meeting during the team's consideration of assistive technology and other special factors. As long as the student has the IEP goals in the area of reading and the trial is part of classroom assessment, it would not be necessary to open a domain again and do further evaluation. And the team might make a decision that the student needs assistive technology or might determine that he did not. Here's another question that we had we had the opportunity to check out. If the team is considering something new, does it go on the considerations page even if the student has not actually tried it? And the response is no. Consideration decisions are based on data about a child's need and a child's performance. The team would not write AT on the IEP if information or data about the need for AT is not available. So if you don't have information, you shouldn't make decisions about anything, but certainly not about a commitment to provide assistive technology for a student. The team might suspend the consideration portion of the IEP and gather more information, which could be done either with evaluation or assessment. So you could open a domain and move forward with some kind of evaluation if you felt that was necessary, or you could go back to the classroom and actually try some things that were readily available in the classroom as part of classroom assessment. If in a particular domain the team agrees that an AT solution is needed, but does not know the specific app or device that they would provide to the child, the team can say yes in consideration. So a lot of the questions we got are kind of summarized in this particular example. And if you look on the left side in the green box, here's an example that the team might write in the yes box. So use of a formative assessment tool indicates that the child benefits from assistive technology that reads text aloud for grade level textbooks. So we tried read aloud computer files or text files with this particular student, and we can demonstrate that there is benefit. The team will determine which read aloud option to use in the next 90 days and begin implementation. And the reason for the next 90 days statement in this example is that the team is not actually committing to providing a particular assistive technology solution. So that needs to follow the legal timeline for assistive technology consideration. So you can suspend the decision about what to provide, but you can't suspend it forever. We've got one more question, I think, and then we're going to talk more about the manual itself.
Gail, before you move on, there's a quick question. Do you mind if I interject?
No, I love it when people interrupt. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I just thought this applied so well to what you were going through. The question is, does a formal report have to be written for an assessment, or is data gathered enough?
There's no mention in the guide or in what I learned about Illinois evaluation process. So I think in a discussion where assessment, trial period assessment is brought to the IEP team, a formal report would not need to be written specifically, but you would have to have data of some sort which reflects how the device applies to a student. So actually this next question is a really good example of that. So the question was, does any new AT presented within the course of teaching require a meeting for domain or evaluation? And the response was, if data about the student's performance using AT that was presented in the course of teaching is considered by the IEP team, then it can be included with other student data and become part of the consideration discussion in an IEP meeting. This is good teaching practice and does not require a domain evaluation. I want to call your attention to the consideration example on the left in the green box, because I think that probably helps to address this question and the one that the person entered in the question box. Here's two examples. First of all, an example, the student tried a read aloud option and his comprehension of the written material increased by 80%. So AT did help. So that would be information that would be brought to the IEP team, hopefully with a bit more information than what's in this example, but would be data that would inform the consideration of assistive technology. The second example is the opposite. The student tried a read aloud option and his Tantrums and behavioral disruptions increased by 80%. AT did not help. Now, these examples are written kind of short and sweet for the sake of room on the slide as much as anything. But I think you see the idea here that we know that we have some students who, when they're presented with auditory stimulus, really find it difficult. And they can kind of melt down on us because of all the auditory stimulus. So for some students, a read aloud option is not a good option because it causes other problems for them. Both of these examples, though, it did help. It increased comprehension by 80%, or it didn't help because the tantrums and disruptions increased by 80%. Both of these could be data that was brought to the IEP team's consideration discussion during an IEP meeting. So I'm hoping that that helped to answer that question as well as the one that was typed in the chat box. Is there anything else, Sam, before I go on?
There is one other question I feel is pertinent at this time, and I don't know if you're coming to this, Gail, but a question came up. Can you give an example of when an evaluation would be needed?
Yeah, why don't you let me move forward in the slides, and we're going to very quickly come back to this topic of evaluation, consideration, and assessment. We covered it last time, and I don't want to spend as much time as we did last time on it today, but I think we can answer some of the questions, and I actually repeated some of the slides from last time because they are text from the guide itself. So let's take a look at the overall structure of the guide, and then I want to ask you a couple of questions about what is the most important to you or the most of interest to those of you who are on the call. There's almost 300 people with us today, so we won't be able to get to every single question, but we should be able to get some information about where we should put our focus for future webinars and for frequently asked questions documents. Chapter 1 is Understanding Assistive Technology. It is a basic overview of what IDEA says about assistive technology devices and assistive technology services, and some of the basic information that's in the Illinois Guide. Chapter 2 takes that information, those definitions, and our understanding of assistive technology, and relates it to the requirements in IDEA. So it's in Chapter 2 that you will see information about the requirement to consider. You'll see information about the requirement to provide assistive technology, things like that. Chapter 3 takes that information even one step farther and relates it to other educational mandates. So it's in Chapter 3 that you will find information about accessible educational materials, universal design for learning, but also things like Section 504, differentiated instruction. We tried to list educational initiatives that were the most common and the ones that we'd probably be the most familiar with, and relate them to the requirement for schools to provide assistive technology. Chapter 4 gets us to understanding the assistive technology process. It's an overview of the next 4 chapters after that. So Chapter 5 is about AT consideration. Chapter 6 is about the educational agency's requirement to provide AT. Chapter 7 is about implementation of assistive technology programs, and Chapter 8 is about continuous progress monitoring of assistive technology use. So we'll cover each of those chapters briefly today, and you do have the guide again provided. So I'm hoping that if you find one of these chapters interesting, you'll be able to delve into it further. For our information today, we have 2 polls that we're going to put up to help us guide the discussion, to help me today be as nimble as possible in addressing the content of the guide, but also to help us in future webinars and future technical assistance. So we're going to see 2 polls, and Sam, I think you're going to put those up for me. Is that true?
That is true. Do you want me to go ahead and launch the first poll, Gail?
Would you please go ahead and launch the first poll? It says, what section of the guide do you feel you're most likely to read first? Choose one.
For first place, there was a close tie between understanding assistive technology was at 28%, and then understanding the AT process was at 26%. Following that was understanding AT requirements with IDEA at 19%, creating infrastructure that supports effective AT service at 17%, and understanding how AT relates to other mandates or initiatives at 10%.
All righty. Well, thank you. That's helpful information. I wrote it on my notes here. Let's do the second poll. So which of these assistive technology processes do you feel you want to learn the most about? Oh, more about, so you can choose all that apply.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll as well and share the results for this one as well. Gail, are you able to see the results for this one?
I can see the results. I just didn't know where to look before. So I can see that almost half of you wanted to learn more about assistive technology implementation. And another large chunk, 44%, are interested in continuous progress monitoring. The other consideration, requirement to provide, and AT transitions were all a little bit lower in priorities, but we have some really good information about what is important to the group. So thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. Let's close that poll and let's go on to the next slide. So chapter 4 is actually a very short chapter in the guide, and it's a summary of understanding the AT process. I think the chapter itself is like 3 or 4 pages long, and it's really focused on these 4 areas that are shown in the chart on this slide. So it shows AT processes as being a cyclic activity that should start with consideration of assistive technology. And in consideration, in the chapter for consideration, we talk again about assessment, evaluation, and consideration. So we're going to get to that in just a minute. Once assistive technology is considered, the district has to provide it, and we'll talk about the rules around that. Once it's provided, we go to implementation, and we think about the kinds of things we need to do to make implementation successful. If you know my work at all, you'll know that I have been really focused on assistive technology implementation and integration for quite a number of years as I do professional development. So this was a chapter that was really fun to review and revise and add some content to, and we'll talk a little bit more about what is included in that chapter in just a minute. And then performance monitoring of ATUs, which leads again to consideration. So we see that that's a cyclic process that the team will go through every year, at least at a minimum every year, because every IEP team every year is required to consider the student's need for assistive technology. Let's look at the consideration chapter. And this is the introduction in that chapter. The IEP team's starting point is consideration of AT. At this point, the team determines whether a student needs AT to receive FAPE. Sometimes the team may already have the knowledge and skills and information to make a decision. At other times, the team may need to access other resources to gather additional information to make a decision. Once the team has sufficient knowledge, skills, and information, they decide whether a student needs AT to receive FAPE, and the decision is documented in the student's IEP to be provided as integrated into the educational program. So hopefully by now, particularly if you've participated in both of the webinars we've offered so far, you have a good vision of what consideration might look like. In the guide, we added some information to clarify that just a little bit. So these are 5 tasks from the Center on Technology and Education at Johns Hopkins University and the Technology and Media Division of CEC, which are recommended as activities that the team should undertake before making a decision about assistive technology for a student. First of all, the team should review academic skills, functional capability, and available assessment and evaluation data. So the team should look at what information you already have. And to me, the second bullet, the number 2 item, is the one that really is critical in terms of the consideration activities in an IEP. Number 2 says the team will develop annual goals, including objectives and benchmarks when appropriate. Now, that really relates directly to whether or not you've done evaluation in a particular area, whether you've opened a domain. So as you've opened a domain, you've collected a lot of information about the student's ability to, let's use communicate, because that's a common one that people think about assistive technology. So you may have assessment data or evaluation data about the student's receptive language, the student's expressive language, and you may have other information that was assessment information that was collected in a classroom setting about how often does the student initiate, or what kinds of utterances or communication strategies does the student use in a real life setting. So all of those things are brought together to help develop annual goals, including objectives and benchmarks if they're appropriate. Then the team would examine the tasks that the student needs to do in order to participate and make progress in educational settings. So that's another thing. There's the learning goals that are specially designed instruction, and then the specific tasks required of the student to participate and make progress in whatever the educational setting is. Evaluate the difficulty of the tasks and the student's functional ability to perform them. And then finally, identify services, supports, including AT, that enable the student to participate and achieve. So these 5 steps at their very best are really the IEP process and the goal development process for any student. What they've done here at the Center on Technology and Education is really focus on the assistive technology aspect of that discussion. So assistive technology should be included in any discussion, and particularly in terms of the supports and services the child might need in order to achieve the goals that the IEP team has developed. In the guide, we offer this flowchart that relates to the 5 steps that we've just talked about. So it's a little small here, and I hope that you are able to read it in the guide even a little better. The first step would be to review current information. Second step, develop IEP goals. And then the flowchart branches here to ask the question, can the student perform tasks necessary to meet IEP goals and objectives and make reasonable progress? If yes, you go one direction, and if no, then you begin to look at perhaps there is a need for accommodations, modifications, or assistive technology. So this flowchart is discussed in depth in the guide, and particularly for people who are new to assistive technology, I want to recommend that you take a look at this and the discussion of this flowchart, because it really gets you into the effective conversation about assistive technology. In the guide also, we talked about activities that could be part of an assistive technology assessment or part of an assistive technology evaluation. So one of the topics that's discussed in the guide in way more depth than we have time for today is the idea of task demand analysis. In that kind of analysis, the team asks questions about the physical, cognitive, linguistic, and environmental demands and variables that are actually in the student's life on an everyday basis in an educational setting. And they begin to look at each of those demands and then ask the question, would assistive technology be of benefit in addressing some of those demands if they are difficult or impossible for the student because of their disability? Another way of approaching this same topic is the second main topic on this slide, which is feature match analysis. The team, if they're doing a feature match analysis, asks the question, if there were an effective tool for this student to use in order to accomplish educational goals and objectives, what would it be like? So the feature match analysis talks about things like portability, talks about things like the assistive technology might not be obtrusive, might not require, a lot of setup, or might be something that other kids in the class are already using, but this student uses in a different way. And then a feature match analysis would also identify the conditions under which the task needs to be performed. So here's an example. If a student demonstrates difficulty decoding grade level tests because of phonographic issues, that would be in the goal area, then a corresponding feature statement might read, provides the student auditory access to the printed text. So in a feature match analysis, we would describe all the features of a particular assistive technology device that we might be wanting to consider, and then identify what devices might be available that would help the student in that area. One of the other things in this chapter talks about how is AT documented in a student's IEP. And this is a list of the different areas in the IEP where assistive technology could be included. There's no way we have time to do justice to this topic, but I did want you to know that there are discussions of each area of the IEP and how assistive technology might be included in the guide itself. So I refer you to the guide to look at that in greater detail. Sam, we're about to start a section where I think we might have a lot of questions, but do we have any questions now?
We had a couple quick specific questions. One was in regard to, do you know if there's any state criteria being able to use read aloud options for students? Like, is there a discrepancy, like the student must be 3 levels below grade level?
I do not know the answer to that question. I think that we have somebody from ISBE on today, but I'm not sure. That's a question I think might be better to hold for checking out more information and maybe addressing it next time.
Okay, we could do that. And then the other question, it was regarding, have you ever seen, does behavior disorder affect the student's ability to comprehend usage of strategy of AT device?
Can you read that again?
Yes. Does behavior disorder affect the student's ability to comprehend usage of strategies of AT devices?
So that's a statement that might be written in the no box?
I think they're asking if you, Robert, if you want to provide any clarifying information, you're welcome to do so to make sure I'm getting the question accurate. I think they're asking if the diagnosis of behavior disorders, is that something that could impact the student's ability to apply strategies to use AT devices?
It could, but doesn't always. Again, I think maybe we need some clarification on that question, or at least a chance to think that out a little bit more. I do know that sometimes kids who have behavior disorders aren't able to use assistive technology because the behaviors get in their way, but also the opposite is true. Sometimes students who have behavior disorders may find that assistive technology takes some of the pressure off of things that are difficult for them, and so that improves their behavior. I think that's kind of a big question for today.
Okay, and then that was it, Gail.
Okay, thank you. Let's go on to the next slide. As you remember from last time, one of the things that we addressed in Chapter 5 in this guide is the requirements in Illinois that whether you say yes, the student needs assistive technology, or whether you say no, assistive technology is not needed, the IEP team must provide some clarification of why that decision was made. So if the yes box is changed, this is a sample of something that might be included to clarify why the team decided that assistive technology is needed. So this example says, based on teacher observation data, Sarah requires specially designed devices to access instruction. The following AT services and or devices will be provided, and then we're going to provide a list of AT that the student needs. If the no box is checked, we can say, Sarah can complete the required instructional tasks and access the school environment using standard classroom adaptations and accommodations and modifications that are already in place. So based on the student's present level of academic and functional performance, Sarah does not need AT services. The one thing that I wanted to emphasize here, and the reason we put it in a second time, was that it is never acceptable if the IEP team says, no, the student does not need assistive technology. The justification should never be, the student doesn't need assistive technology for FAPE. There needs to be more explanation in that if no is checked, so that the decision-making basis is addressed there. Again, last time we talked about the differences between AT consideration, AT assessment, and AT evaluation. We're going to go over these briefly this time, and I gave you the same slides as we had in the last presentation because there were so many questions about it. I wanted you to have the words, but hopefully we've addressed a lot of those questions, and we can talk about some of the other content in this webinar. So considerations, a relatively brief process that occurs during an IEP meeting where the team determines whether or not a student needs assistive technology. We've looked at your state level IEP forms, and we know that in Illinois you have to explain the decision that the team makes as you do that consideration. The thing that we felt was important to emphasize here is that in certain situations, tools may prove beneficial, that may prove beneficial to a student are readily available. And it's okay to go ahead and try those tools and then present them as part of the information and a consideration decision. But sometimes you don't have enough information. So this is the section that says, if you don't have enough information and you want to collect additional information, you decide that during an IEP meeting, what you might be doing is opening up the need for an AT evaluation. And then the AT evaluation would be considered at a later date. That, once you open an evaluation, that's referred to in Illinois as opening a domain, and a request for an AT evaluation could be initiated by any team member who believes that there isn't enough information to make a decision about AT. It could be that the evaluation is conducted by the members of the IEP team, or you don't have to have a specialist, but you could bring in people who have more information to help you with that. If you decide to have an evaluation and you are not able as an IEP team to make a decision, then what's important to do is to suspend the process, not make a decision even though you don't have enough information, but suspend the consideration part of the IEP until the evaluation is complete. That evaluation, once it's started, does not absolve the team from meeting legal timelines. So once an evaluation, a domain is opened and evaluation is started, procedural safeguards and timelines do apply. Once you do that also, it's important to have parental consent. So that is another thing that we wanted to make sure you had the citation for in the guide. I want to go back one more time to assessment. Assessment is the teaching practice of trying new things within the context of a student's educational program to see how they'll work, if there's a way to improve the instruction that's going on in a classroom. And sometimes that assessment could include ongoing assessment of a student's performance in relation to any kind of AT need. An assessment might be conducted by instructional staff that work with the student most often and those are the people that are most likely to be able to try things a little less formally and bring information to the IEP meeting. Here's a couple more questions from the last session. Do you have to wait for an annual review to consider assistive technology? The response is no. If during the course of instruction somebody feels that AT might be of benefit, the need should be addressed. It could be addressed as an assessment, or it could be addressed as a formal evaluation. If additional expertise is needed, it would be a district and IEP team decision about how to handle these suspected needs. And we know that IEP meetings can happen at any time during a school year. We are required to do them annually, but if there's a need, we can do them more often. Does an AT evaluation require opening domains? An AT evaluation does include opening domains, and all timelines would apply. AT classroom assessment as part of ongoing instruction is part of high quality instruction and does not need a domain open. So hopefully we've got that. And again, the discussion of what if we decide that a student needs assistive technology during an IEP meeting, that during the consideration part of an IEP meeting, but we're not sure exactly what. So here's some example wording that we ran by the folks at ISBE, and they tentatively said that this looks like it would be acceptable wording. The team has determined that an AT evaluation is necessary to establish whether AT would benefit the student. The team will use the IEP evaluation process and update AT information throughout the IEP within 60 days. So that gets back to, we've got to start an evaluation so the timelines apply. Chapter 6. Oh, I probably should stop here and say any more questions, Dan.
Yes, we did have one question. If doing a classroom assessment, if the person doing this is not the classroom teacher or case manager, do you need to get parent permission since the focus is on a specific student?
That's a question that's come up several times about when is parent permission needed if you're bringing in someone who's not normally on the student's IEP team or educational team. And we talked about that last week and really felt like we needed some further guidance. It's not truly an AT question. It's a question about bringing people into a classroom environment who don't normally work on a regular basis with the student. So that's what I want to put off.
Okay. I was going to say, Erin also looked for clarification. It depends on who it is. Was her.
Yeah. Yes. And Erin and I were the ones that had that conversation. So it really does depend on who the extra person is. We'll put that on the list of key things that we'd like to get some clarification on and hopefully be able to provide it to you next week.
Okay, and I saw other questions pop up. Did you want to hold on those, Gail? Or
yeah, we're running short of time, and I want to get through the overview of the rest of these chapters, and then I'm happy to stay on and answer further questions when if we go over time a little bit, if you can do that.
Yep, that works.
Okay, so chapter 6, provision of assistive technology. So this chapter discusses the agency's responsibility to provide the assistive technology that the IEP team has identified, to access funding sources during this step, and the timelines that go along with that. I think the most important sentence on this slide is that the time between deciding what AT to provide and actually providing it to the student should be as short as possible. And I'm sure that you have guidance about provision of many other services in Illinois that would apply also to assistive technology provision. These are the questions that are the subheadings in Chapter 6. Questions like who owns the AT when it is purchased by the school? Can family insurance be used to pay for assistive technology? Can a school seek other sources of funding? These are the kinds of questions we address. There are responses to each of these questions in Chapter 6. So I really want to encourage you to take a look at Chapter 6 if you have concerns about any of these questions. One of the things that did come up last time that I wanted to address today was who's responsible for providing the assistive technology if an IEP team determines that it's necessary. ISCE was able to help us develop this chart, which I think should clarify a lot of the different roles. You can see that if the student is placed in a charter school under a district, the district that authorizes the charter has the responsibility to provide the technology. If it's an independent charter school or district, the charter school itself must provide. If the child is district placed in a private school, the district has the responsibility to provide the assistive technology the student needs. But if the student is parentally placed in a private school, there's no obligation on the district to provide assistive technology. So hopefully that chart will help to clarify some of the issues. And go ahead and take a look at these questions. If you have specific questions about any of these topics, feel free to either type it in the chat box now or send them to me by email after the webinar is over. Chapter 7 is about implementation. What do we do after we've considered the need for assistive technology and provided it to the student, written it in the IEP? Again, there's a form that's included in the guide which walks you through the steps of implementation planning, and there's a discussion of each of these steps in the guide itself. One of the questions that often comes up is, in terms of implementation, is can assistive technology be used on statewide assessments? The response in the guide is that use of AT tools and systems may be permitted on statewide assessments. However, the AT must be appropriately documented in the student's IEP. So it has to be in the IEP in order for the student to use it on state assessments. And then some state assessments may have restrictions or limitations on the kinds of accommodations and assistive technology the student can use depending on the nature of the assessment. So it's really important to read those assessment guides, the administrator's manuals for those guides, to know whether or not the student can use assistive technology on statewide assessments. There's lots more in the chapter about implementation, and maybe we'll come back to that in a future webinar, but we have one more chapter to talk about today, and that's progress monitoring. So the words you see on the slide here are the introduction to the progress monitoring chapter in the guide. And when we're doing progress monitoring, we're either saying AT is working and continues to be needed, not working, but continues to be needed, so a change is needed, or AT is no longer needed. Those are the potential outcomes of looking at the student's use of assistive technology and their progress toward educational goals. The guide uses a time series, concurrent, and differential approach to looking at progress monitoring, which I found very useful. in this chart, the green line is the expected performance level of all students in this student's curriculum. The red line is that student's performance without assistive technology, and the blue dotted dash line is the student's performance when using assistive technology. So it uses this graphing approach to really talk about whether or not assistive technology is having a benefit over time in the student's achievement and accomplishing of educational goals. There's way more words about that in Chapter 7, which I encourage you to read also, and look at the ways where you might improve your activities in terms of performance monitoring and making ongoing decisions about consideration. As we said early on, performance monitoring gets us to the next consideration activity where we can say, is the assistive technology having a good effect for the student? Again, I want to encourage you to type your questions in the chat box or the question box to help us prepare for the next two webinars. The next two webinars are May 11th, which is next Monday, where we'll be talking about Chapter 9, the transition of students who use assistive technology. We'll also be addressing any questions that came out of today and ones that we weren't able to answer. And then on the following Monday, May 18th, at the same time as today, we'll be talking about creating an infrastructure to support effective AT services. So effective AT services at the district level. If you have questions or concerns, these are the people that you can talk to. We're talking a lot to each other right now as we get clarification and understand your questions better. So any one of us is happy to take your emails in terms of content of the guide. These are places where you can also get a copy of the guide. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I am happy to take additional questions if we can. And again, as we did last week, I will get a copy of the questions that were typed into the question box, and we'll try and address as many of those as possible next week. So, Tam, you got anything else for me?
Are you up for taking 3 questions right now, Gail? Would that be okay?
I will do my best.
Okay. One of the questions was, can you further clarify what is included as part of assistive technology services?
There's a specific list of assistive technology services in IDEA, and there are 6 of them, which I do not have memorized, but I will make sure that we put them up on a slide next time. They include evaluation, training for professionals, training for staff, provision of assistive technology, maintenance, and, I'm sorry, one other one. If you look in the guide, you will see that list right below the definition of assistive technology services, which I believe is in Chapter 2.
Thank you, Gail. The next question, if a team doesn't have enough information during the consideration conversation, can we use assessment if the domain is already identified instead of an AT evaluation?
Yes, I believe that's what we're saying. If you decide you need more information, you might go ahead and use classroom assessment, which is often trial periods of particular devices to determine what assistive technology the child needs, particularly if the domain is already open and you do have evaluation data about the child's performance in a particular domain. So if we're talking about reading is the most common one. If the child already has reading goals and you're just thinking that assistive technology might be useful, you could use assessment. You cannot, though, suspend the timeline of the IEP. So the trial period, either you would write, actually we had a question that kind of addressed that. I don't know if I can find it real quick or not. If the team, I'm sorry, that isn't it. I think that's the best I can do right now. I will get the text of that specific question, and we'll address it next time.
Perfect. And this will be the final question. As Gail shared, the other questions I will forward directly on to her, so she'll be able to kind of integrate that within the next session. For this final question, in a large high school environment where we provide things like text-to-speech, voice dictation, word prediction to every student, is the same level of data required for every student, given that they will have access to the technology no matter what?
Is the same level of data required for every student? When a student needs assistive technology, even though they're in an environment like the one you described where every student could use text-to-speech if they wanted to, it is important that the IEP team write into the IEP any technology, assistive technology that the student might need in order to benefit from their educational program and achieve goals. So if everybody in the school who wants to is using text-to-speech, but the student that you're considering it for must have it in order to have access to their textbooks, then that needs to be written into the IEP itself. And the consideration statement would say, yes, the student needs it for access to information for their textbooks. I can't speak specifically to the level of data. I believe that would be different for every student. So if there's more clarification that's needed in that question, I'd appreciate it if the person would type it into the question box, or if that's sufficient, let me know that too.
Okay, sounds good. We will go ahead and we'll log that info. So Lisa, if there's additional information you need, please feel free to type it in and I will share with Gail. Gail, did you have any other final comments or things you wanted to share with attendees?
No, I don't think so. I'm hoping that I'll see many of you again on Monday. We'll be doing focus on the transition chapter, the new transition chapter that's in the guide. We haven't had one before. And also sounds like addressing a bunch of questions during that session.
Thank you so much, Gail. And you got thanks from a lot of folks in the audience, and several people commented that they really did appreciate the question and answer session at the beginning because they know you put extra time into getting that ready, and they thought it was very well thought out and very meaningful to them. So thank you for that. So this will conclude today's webinar. Thank all of you for attending, and thank you again, Gail, for presenting and sharing your expertise with us, and I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you all for joining us.